The convening is on behalf of a number of us. The NRGI, Climate Action Network, Publish What You Pay, the SIRGE Coalition, and Oxfam. And I was just acknowledging that I think we all recognize how much critical minerals is the conversation du jour, because we know from the studies, for instance, from the World Bank in 2017, in 2018, reinvigorated in 2020, that critical minerals in many ways are inevitable for the kind of green outcomes that the world envisages and is working towards. In one study, the World Bank estimated that 3 billion tons of critical minerals and metals would be needed for a transition in the below 2 degrees scenario. It is, of course, difficult to predict with specificity what the future might hold because there are many variables. If you take, for instance, minerals like copper that are more versatile, that could be deployed in a variety of technologies, the scenario might be different when you look at, let's say, lithium, specifically in relation to batteries, for instance. Be that as it may, it is very clear that at the very least on these projections, we are looking at something like potentially a quadrupling of demand in terms of the need for critical minerals. So this is serious, it's serious stuff. Particularly when you think about the fact that, you know, whether you call these green minerals, whether you call it transition minerals, whether you call it anything else, including critical minerals, the bottom line is this is about mining. And we know from our experience across the room, including many of you that have known from first-hand experience in your work and in your allyship and solidarity with communities that are on the front line of mines, we do know that mining has had significant issues that it has also raised with respect to human rights, with respect to environment, with respect to questions of equity and justice in terms of the impact on communities and also on producing countries. And we know, for instance, again, even from World Bank studies, that in the region of 70% of activities that are being done in mining by the top 6 companies that are involved in mining across the world, these are taking place in regions that are water stressed, for instance. So if you look at it just from the contestation of resources that are scarce, such as water resources, for instance, if you look at it from the standpoint of human rights, if you look at it from a number of perspectives, it is an issue. So on our part, as Oxfam, for over 20 years, we have worked on these issues in at least 25 countries. And our experience has been over those years that it is clear that we must continue in the oil, gas, and mining arena to hold governments accountable, to hold corporates accountable, but to also amplify and support the voices of human rights defenders, of indigenous and local communities in their engagement with free, prior informed consent and many other rights that are recognized under international law. We know the urgency, therefore, to decarbonize our energy systems and to be able to build clean technologies. And we see what this will require, as I was just outlining. So it is in this context that we really welcomed as Oxfam the initiative by the UN Secretary General to come up with the panel. And we know that the panel worked tremendously hard between April and September to be able to come up with a report by the 11th of September that has been available for all of you to download and to read. And we know that in that context, this conversation must continue, that this is only the beginning. The multi-stakeholder engagement that the panel had is exactly what is needed, because we need to be converging the interests and perspectives of producing countries and producing economies, you know, of high income purchasers or high level purchasers in terms of expenditure in money, but also of corporates themselves of indigenous local communities, et cetera, and everybody that's involved in the value chain. So it is in this context that we are having the conversation about the panel and the report. And I know that we are all keen to hear from our esteemed panel. I think I have a star-studded panel here. But just before I come back to them, let's start by hearing from one of the co-chairs of the panel and Director General Ditte. Jørgensen has been involved with the panel, but also related issues. It's on, I assure you.
Thank you very much to everyone for as a recognition of the importance of the topic, of the importance of the report, but even more, I would allow myself to interpret it as a recognition of the need for action and the need for change. And so I will say not so much about what is in the actual report, and really rather try to focus on what are the next steps and how do we bring this from paper to reality. Because a report, as good as the principles are and the recommendations, but a report is only as good as the action and the change it brings. And so the focus now, I think, certainly for me as co-chair and hopefully for other panel members, the real issue now is how do we take it forward? How do we make sure that there is a follow-up? And how do we make sure that we help at least start a process of change and start a process of international engagement in addressing what are the many existential challenges related to critical energy transition minerals. The first of those challenges that brought about the establishment of the panel is, of course, climate change and the need to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And as you have said, that will require so much more in terms of the quantity of the minerals. So we have taken that as a given in our work in the panel. The second existential aspect of the challenges is, of course, the lack of gain, the lack of participation of resource-rich countries in the value chain, the fact that it brings often environmental damage, human rights concerns, child labor, and I could list a long list of issues that has historically been linked to critical minerals, both extraction but also downstream. And so it is an existential question for all of us, not just for resource-rich developing countries, but for all of us to help bring change in that value chain and to start that process of change. It's important for the countries, for the local populations, for indigenous peoples, but it's also important for everyone, again, because we need the minerals for the mitigation of climate change, and we need them for the more resilient and smarter value chains than what we have now. And so my request to you, because I only have a few seconds left, so my request to you is please share your thoughts about what can be done, and please help bring this forward, because if we do not have a lively debate and a full engagement, including from civil society organizations and all stakeholders, without that engagement, we're not going to be able to bring change. And so for that same reason, I am deeply grateful, Suneeta and Anabella, to you for your engagement in the panel, as I am to you, Septian, because really you helped lift both the floor and the ceiling and really helped nudge this upwards to an ambitious outcome. And I hope you will help push this forward, not just for an ambitious report and good recommendations, but for real change. So I look forward to continuing the work with you, and I look forward to hearing from all of you.
Thank you so much, Ditte. We appreciate your leadership with the panel. So I'll move straight then to the panel, and I won't spend too much time introducing them, but I'll just say a word as I call upon each of them to speak. So they will initially speak, giving comments on one question that I'm posing for all of you, actually, which essentially is, we heard from Ditte the importance, obviously, of the report and the vision of the panel and the outcomes that were produced. So the question really is, how do we translate these principles, this vision, into something that's concrete, that can actually be beneficial for the communities, individuals, nations that we need to be served by the report and by this vision? And in your experience, what would that take? What actually is needed? So I'll start with Septian. So Septian Hario Seto is Deputy Minister of Investment and Mining Coordination of the Coordinating Minister of Maritime and Investment Affairs in Indonesia. He was on the panel. Over to you, Septian.
Thank you for the moderator, and I'm very honored to be speaking here, invited by Suneeta from NRGI, and very happy to see Ambassador Ditte, Anna, and all the colleagues here. So I guess this is very interesting journey, especially for me as a government official, because the members of the panel consist of different organizations, and we have a balanced view about how we can push forward these principles and actionable recommendation. I think one thing that as a government very important is about the traceability issue, because this is actually your tools to monitor whether your regulation can be implemented, whether your regulation is being followed or not. So I think this is very important tools for a country as big as Indonesia. You will see the difficulties. We have very big area and territory. We have a mining area located in the remote area. So there has to be a tool to actually monitor these mining activities, including, I think, providing the buyer of this commodity a way to actually implement and monitor their principles as well. So in Indonesia, we start back in 2022, whereby we implement a digital traceability system for our coal mining. So in Indonesia now, every ton of coal that we produce in Indonesia, we know actually who is the producer, where is the mine location, what is the type of the permit, what is their environmental permit, and then, we put a control system so that if, for example, they don't pay the government a royalty, there is no way that their vessel, which transport this coal, can be allowed to leave Indonesian water. This is very important tools. It's a digital system so that it cannot be manually intervened by the government official. So everything has to go through and flow into the system. So about 2 months ago, we expand the system into nickel and tin. So what happened is that on the nickel, because we do not allow export of the raw material, we include not only the mining, but also the smelter into the system. So we can monitor actually the producer of the nickel ore, this is mining A, is bought by the smelting A. So we know the balance, the amount of they produce and the amount that they buy. So it has to be balanced. If there is imbalance, then which means we know that there is some illegal activities. So this is very powerful tools. What is the benefit for the buyer? The buyer can actually see if I buy the nickel coming out from Indonesia, from the smelting A, then I can know who is actually the miners. Miners A, B, C, D. And then if, for example, I am a Tesla, I don't like this mine, I can say to the smelter, I don't want you to buy from this nickel ore. For a government, this is very powerful tool, because if we found out that there is problem with their environmental permit, we can block the system so that this company will not be able to sell their mining product, whether this is the raw material or this is the smelter product. Excellent. We have experienced this one in the coal, and this is actually expanded into the nickel and tin. So for us as a government, having this traceability system is very basic principle for us to actually monitor our regulation.
Yeah,
thank you.
So we'll come back to you later, but it's great that you have said that scene in terms of how your government is engaging with these issues. So appreciating that very much. I'll move on to my good friend Suneeta. Suneeta is well known to you all as President and CEO of the Natural Resources Governance Institute. And Suneeta, on the same questions, how would you look at this?
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see so many friendly faces and also new faces today. And I wanted to actually start with just a moment of appreciation, as you did, Ditte, to you as co-chair and to my fellow panel members, but actually also to all of you around the world, because I think one of the things that the panel really relied on was building on the shoulders and the work that has been done for decades before us. And so we were very fortunate to benefit from a tremendous brain trust in many of our civil society colleagues around the world. And when I think about what really stands out for the panel, I think about it as two bookends, where we started from and where we ended with. The first bookend was just the recognition that the Secretary General gave to the importance of equity and justice on the same plane as the urgency of climate action was such a tremendous starting point. And I think if we can continue to build and capture that narrative that says at the heart of all of our actions needs to be a recognition that energy transition can leave no one behind. And that was a tremendous starting point for a conversation that has otherwise largely been dictated by geopolitics and many of the global north needs. The second was something that Seto mentioned as well, which is the starting point was saying this conversation has to include a much broader discussants. It can't just include governments, and certainly can't just include global north governments, but needs to include the producing countries from the low and middle income countries around the world. It needs to include civil society. It needs to include industry. It needs to include indigenous peoples. It needs to include local communities. And that any pathway forward has to include that combination. So that was the starting point. And in that sense, we had a little bit of a win already from the beginning, just by where we started. The other bookend is where we ended. And one of the key evolutions of the panel was to move from principles alone to actions. And so early on, the panel decided it wasn't going to be enough to just capture principles. We needed to state actions that could chart a way forward. Now, we had great ambitions, as Ditte said, but we also had some realism that in 4 months, trying to disentangle geopolitics, trade disputes, the dynamics between companies and governments and civil society was not something we were going to be able to nail. But what we wanted to do was signpost. What are the issues that we absolutely have to grapple with if we are going to put equity and justice at the center of this conversation? And one of those that I think is really critical is the first action, which on paper sounds kind of boring maybe. Okay, establish a high-level advisory group to advise on benefit sharing, economic diversification, and value addition. And that may sound boring, but actually embedded in that is a whole range of different issues that we weren't able to tackle, but we said, let's take the time, let's engage in these conversations and truly be able to respond to what we've heard from producing countries, which is that this time has to be different. So I'll stop there and then eager to hear your questions, reflections, and how we can take this conversation forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suneeta. I'll move on to Anabella Rosemberg. So Anabella is a senior advisor for Just Transition for the Climate Action Network. Anabella, on the same question, please.
Thank you very much. And yes, I mean, such a pleasure. And also, I guess we coming into this place with a lot of humility, humbled by the task we were asked to do. I think when we saw our names, speaking on behalf of Suneeta as well, but when we saw that our names in that panel, I guess we felt also the pressure from all our civil society colleagues and saying, where are you going and what are you going to do there? I think we are often challenged by those situations. We spend most of our time trying to convince governments to do things, and often from behind, in particular, all the folks here that are working on advocacy. We spend a lot of our time in the corridors trying to convince, and now the SG is telling us, well, come on in and speak up. And I guess the first reaction we got from
from our friends in civil society was, well, just ensure that there's no harm is done, at least to the many people that are actually fighting in the communities about this. And I have to say that looking at this from a Climate Action Network perspective, probably for many groups that are working on human rights, on mining justice, environmental justice, they were looking maybe at our engagement with some level of skepticism, because the climate movement has not been very good. I mean, at listening to what communities on the ground are saying. We've not been good. And I think in our eagerness to push for an energy transition, we have overlooked what this new model, this new energy transition could mean on the ground for many people. So trying to navigate the tension between what we do need, I mean, a 100% renewables powered world, but one that doesn't reproduce the extractive model that has taken us to where we are, I think is one that we need to navigate also with a lot of, as I said, humility, and embrace the fact that this climate movement also needs to work toward justice in a much more determined way. That means that we really pushed very hard, thanks to all of your support and also your reminders that we should not let down some of the important topics that I think we managed to appeal, I mean, to our government colleagues in the panel. First, making very clear that there's no conversation about justice possible on critical minerals or transition minerals if we don't talk about the reduction on the energy demand side. I mean, the Global North has a massive responsibility in making those precious minerals useful and used very carefully. I mean, we cannot waste what we're doing, and a lot of that is going not necessarily where is needed. And on the other side, the conversation about rights and justice and the ability of developing countries to have a prosperity pathway. So those elements are in tension, and I think, well, there is an offer there. I know my time is up, but what I wanted to say is that what is happening now with this document, that is just a document, but it's my invitation for all of you to read it, will depend a lot on us. I mean, whether we make a few bets of trying to make this happen in the real world. And I'm extremely hopeful, Chair, that this historical convergence of groups, climate groups, mining, environmental justice groups, indigenous peoples, human rights groups, that happened before this panel will be able to deliver something very different of what we've seen until now in terms of our movement impact. Okay.
So at this point in time, I want to then continue with the preliminary remarks and input. Now from Galina. So Galina is Executive Director of the SIRGE Coalition. Galina, on the same question.
Ditte, while you're heading, I just wanted to say that the right to development, we agree with that, right? We agree, right to development. But first and foremost, it's the right to exist. Because what we're having now is the existential crisis and threat to indigenous peoples. 54% of all transition minerals are either on or near the lands of indigenous peoples. And we, first and foremost, it's the right to exist. And then we're talking about the right to development. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your work. And to conclude my remarks, I hope I have some time, so little time, so much to say, right? Thank you so much, Suneeta and Anabella. You have been such wonderful partners because you've opened the doors. You've been open, transparent, inclusive. You allowed many, many, many organizations to participate. You allowed SIRGE to come in. I'm so very grateful for Evelyn, for Payal for providing the substantive input into the civil society hub that you created for us to be there. SIRGE is not a panel member. We're not. But we were able to engage through the openness and inclusivity that you have provided. We have also supported the UN Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We were able to create that link between the Civil Society Hub and the UN Permanent Forum and streamline our positions together. Because if we're together, we're much, much, much stronger in our positions and moving forward our solutions. I want to also say I'm grateful to the UN Secretary General for his understanding, for his concern, for his real compassion for indigenous peoples, right? It was reflected. The document that we have right now is reflecting indigenous peoples' rights. Okay, 28 references to indigenous peoples, 4 references to free, prior, informed consent, 2 references to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 1 reference to self-determination. It's a dream document, right? No. we tried to do our best. Did we get everything that we wanted? Did we get everything that we wanted? No. Did we try our best? Yes. Sleepless nights, fighting for every comma, fighting for every word. I know it happens. Okay, we were able to get the document, but a lot of the specificities that are peculiar to our constituencies sometimes are forsaken, sacrificed for the sake of universality. That's just the reality of this work. There are setbacks. I'm hoping I'm going to be able to talk about the setbacks in the document because they are very crucial for our constituency. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Galina. And thank you for your ongoing work on behalf of the Akirit Nation, of the Buria peoples as an indigenous community in Russia, that you really reflected eloquently in your remarks. And I will then also move on to care. So publish what you pay. Again, as Galina was also saying, you are a key player, a key actor, but you were also able to access the panel via the friends that were on the panel and their inclusion of your work. But could you also speak from your deep experience as publish what you pay, working on accountability and transparency on this question around how do we translate the document into concrete action?
Thanks a lot, Tawanda. And yeah, we were not part of the panel, but we are part of it through those wonderful people, just as Galina said. So for those of you who don't know Publish What You Pay, we are a movement which for the last 20 years was striving, for accountability and transparency in the extractive industry. And this is one of our, I would say, achievements, along with other partners like Transparency International, was the creation of the ITI. So it is well established now. And we were thinking that it's time to, move ahead, move forward, especially in the context of the energy transition, because we are carrying the voices of more than 1,000 civil society organizations and community organizations across the world. In more than 50 countries, we have to do and make something more about that. And then the panel on critical minerals gave us the occasion to express those needs of local communities and CSOs striving for justice for all in the energy transition. How to translate the report, into reality. We made concrete propositions and proposals towards that. We just launched a report on value addition on the critical mineral supply chain in Africa as a big example, because we know that Africa is home to 30% of the world's reserves on critical minerals, but yet it is still the continent which is the most suffering from energy poverty. And only 2% of those critical minerals are used within African countries to make a difference. This has to change. We have the feeling that most of the benefits from this potential market is going to the north and not benefiting those countries who are whose the resources are extracted from. It's not only Africa, it's the LAC, it's the other regions. But in Africa especially, we found out that if we created a continental market of critical minerals, improving the value chain, transforming the materials on the continent, it could generate potentially $24 billion of GDP a year and 2.3 million jobs. So that's huge, but it doesn't have to happen at all costs. It has to happen if only communities consent, if there are strong safeguards in terms of governance, anti-corruption especially, and if all the rights, including FPIC, are protected, and we have to break trade barriers as well. ISDS, FTAs, there are lots of things to be corrected. And I think that right now, maybe we should think of the creation of an OPEC kind of organization for critical minerals, producing countries, like for petroleum in the 1970s. Why not? This is just one of those bold ideas that we gave. Now it's up to us to make it happen, really. And starting from now, it is crucial. The adoption of the Pact for the Future is also something, adds another momentum to the panel. So yeah, the future can be bright if we are the will to doing it and really to pushing for our rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm also glad actually that you put your neck out, as it were, to be provocative about ideas such as your OPEC idea, or OPEC equivalent idea, because I think there are a number of ideas that people will have about pros and cons of that from what we have seen and so on with OPEC, but that's exactly the kind of conversation that we need to have at a granular, serious level in terms of taking forward the report. So just before I come back to Anabella, I want to recognize Maurice. Where is Maurice sitting? Is he here? Okay. All right. So I thought he had made it. So I'll turn back now then to a second round that involves also a question and answer where we can engage. And I know that there was a question for you, Anabella, if you want to pick that up to begin with.
Yes, it's working. So the question, I love always Jim because he always likes ask me these questions that I'm absolutely passionate about. This is good friends. But I also acknowledge that there are people that want to ask for the floor, so I will not be very long. I think the UNFCCC is, of course, a very contested space. It's tough to get things in there, and certainly it's not a process that like parachuting of concepts or other kinds of documents. So let's just take that, again, the can geek speaking. But we have been working now for quite some time in the UNFCCC on what is now called the Just Transition Work Program, which is a space now in the agenda, first year that is fully being discussed. And what we have promoted or asked for as civil society is that Just Transition Work Program is able to cover as much the just transition of the phase out. So, and not only phase out of fossils, like the transition away from fossil fueling, which that was adopted last year, but also the transition of food systems, so other sectors that need to change, but also the transition for phasing in. So how do we phase in renewable energies in this world with justice and equity? One of the things, and I will just say that for us, we are facing a moment with COP29 coming, you know how hard civil society is pushing on the whole issue of climate finance, because in the end, that is the roadblock for more ambition. I mean, if we are not able to provide developing countries with more resources for the transition, the ambition will never go up. So we are a little bit stuck on the reality of things, not that much on the narratives, but on the reality of energy policy. So we have that coming, but there are other enabling difficulties, or let's say other barriers for ambition. And those are the ones that we want to address in the Just Transition Work Program. I agree wholeheartedly with Kay, on other elements that are fundamental for international cooperation, the changing of some trade rules. And Deputy Seto was an absolute resource in the panel, bringing the experience of Indonesia and how it has to also confront itself with some of the rules of the game as they exist so that they could grow their domestic supply chain. But that policy space today doesn't exist for many countries. So how do we allow that playing field? The issue of investment rules and also the issue of safeguards. if we are talking about just transition, what are those minimum safeguards that need to be put in place everywhere? So we are not seeing that necessarily as a win in COP29. Like, we are pushing for that. We have, I mean, the conversation there today, I mean, it's going to be about whole of the economy, just transition pathways, but we are certainly seeking for a package for COP30 on just transition as a way to turn the Paris architecture upside down. Like, let's discuss the enabling conditions for a just transition, and NDCs and national commitments would come.
That's great. Thank you, Anabella. So I want to then continue with a conversation between us and the panel. But I'm hoping that, among other things, we can also at some point go back to some concerns that you have, Galina, about the document, because I think you had previewed that while we are acknowledging the strong part in the document, that the document does indeed have dimensions around supporting human rights defenders, around recognizing the rights of local and indigenous communities, as you said, around benefit sharing between producing countries and those that are benefiting and extracting, and the corporates that are involved, and so on. So while we have these and other benefits and good things that are in the document, but there are also some real challenges, including that we can't take for granted, even the stupendous statistics that we were talking about at the beginning, in terms of the demand itself, that we need to quadruple by 2050 in terms of critical minerals. How do we deal with some level of managing demand, just given the impact also on communities, as we were saying, for their very existential right to live and to exist? And how do we deal with secularity and so on, right? And still in that section, let's go to the back there, yeah. Yeah, right at the corner there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Suneeta from the EI. Executive director was part of this panel. You know, one of the issues that we were very pleased to see reflected in the principles was the issue of corruption. In the room are very aware that there's a long track record of resource booms leading to more corruption, and that has all sorts of negative consequences. In the spirit of sort of focusing in on actions, I'd be interested in panel's views on what they see as some really concrete steps that the kind of community that's been working on these principles can take to more effectively tackle corruption risks, specifically in them. Thanks.
Thank you so much. And I hope that we were able to hear. There were some intermittent sort of paths in terms of the mic, but I hope that we got the gist of it. Then let's take the last one, that side, right at the back there, back and side. So, yeah, right there. Thank you.
Hello. Consulting and technology company in our ESG function. And so I would love to know very concretely, as a corporation that is many steps removed from, you know, the mines, what we should codify as corporates into our procurement policies, into our environmental policies on that theme of action. What can I go and tell my procurement function today? We need to change our policy to say X.
Thank you so much. And that helps us think about the value chain in a sort of a smarter way, beyond the immediate practice on the ground. So I know that there is more that side, but I will come now to the middle section. So I may come back there depending on time. So I see a hand over there. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Ketakandriana. I'm quite curious about this report because even as much as we're talking about diversification, our African mining vision has, you know, investment in local production and value addition. But with all this happening with the UN, Europe, US, is all thinking about critical raw minerals. So which one will precede, the report or their policies? Because let's be practical and very clear, because this is a political conversation. as much as we'll have all these nice reports and the Secretary General will talk about it, but as the ambassador said, interests. So the EU will pass its policy and push for critical raw minerals. You're seeing the US, because of China, is coming up together with 14 countries who want to determine who gets what minerals. So at the end of the day, the rest of us, especially where the minerals are, as he said, are just playing the politics of who has the power to take the minerals out as fast as they can.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that dimension. Tony Beddington at the Ford Foundation and others worked on a book on governance dimensions and political settlements in the extractive industries. And I think that's what you're challenging us to also think about, the politics and power and governance, right? And the intersection of what we are talking about. So thank you for that. I see another hand somewhere here. Right, okay, so in front here, we can pass on the mic here. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. No problem. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My name is Nabila and I'm a student at Columbia University. I see that lots of governments across the globe, they try to achieve this net zero 2050 by subsidizing electric vehicles, which I don't think this policy to be particularly socioeconomically inclusive, because obviously by using taxpayers' money for something that is usually enjoyed by rich people, the lower class seems to don't really find this to be beneficial for them. And I'm just curious, what do these people here in this panel think about this policy? Are governments correct for making such rules? Or if you agree, what are the reasons that actually justify it? Thank you very much.
Okay, look at the text. Principle 1, paragraph 17. It acknowledges indigenous people's rights, both individual and collective. And it acknowledges free, prior, and informed consent. Marvelous. Then it comes with comma. And after comma, it says, while taking into account national specificity and legal context. What does this mean? In the context of indigenous peoples, we know many legal regimes do not recognize the rights of indigenous peoples. What that means, that when you go to the national context, there will be no conversation with indigenous peoples to recognize their FPIC or self-determination or whatsoever. So this basically closes the door on the national level. The second setback is the omission of a specific actionable recommendation focused on indigenous people's rights. And basically what we needed from that process are actionable recommendations, turning vision into reality. It didn't happen, but what we want the vision to be implemented into reality on the ground level. So these are the two important setbacks that we had in the process. I want to also answer some of the questions. The lady talked about the procurement processes. What do we do? We have been working with some end user companies. I think it is important to engage with indigenous peoples, learn about the rights, learn about the right to free, prior, informed consent. We were successfully able to move Tesla and Ford, developing their own processes around free, prior, informed consent, including indigenous people's policy as part of their supplier code of conduct, procurement policy, human rights policies, and so on. There's a lot of room to grow, but you have to really follow up with your first tier, second tier, third tier, fourth tier suppliers. And it's not just about policy. It's not just about paper. It's about the implementation. I have other answers, but I'll move on.
That's great, Galina. And I'll come back to you, Anabella, but since you had a second bite at the cherry, I'll go to Suneeta and in that order, and then Septian. So Suneeta, please.
No.
Soldier on.
Okay. So I guess the first question that I want to address is this one of the politics versus the rhetoric. It's probably the most consistent question that we have gotten and following the panel. Like, great. So Secretary General, really fond of panels, really fond of summits, really fond of big, beautiful words. And I'm a huge fan of his. But the "and so what" is very challenging. And just earlier this week, the MSP financing network was launched. This should be an exciting opportunity to see the kind of financial resources that are needed to make realities like that come to fruition. And yet we aren't seeing the mirroring of the language about equity and the need to center equity and transparency in those agreements as well. And too often, those bilateral agreements have no more information than what is in the press release announcing them. So how do we fill this gap? How do we bring together the conversation that is happening at the political power level with the one that is happening in the ambition and idealism level? And what I will say is this: yes, equity and justice, these are words that we've been using a lot and I think are quite popular. And what we are trying to do now with this next phase of the work of the panel is engage with the Gordian knots that exist and need to be untied in order to actually see benefits for communities and people in low and middle income producing countries, and also to address those harms. And that is about concessional financing to address infrastructure bottlenecks, to address skilled labor bottlenecks, to understand, again, what has prevented literally decades of economic benefit to these countries. And that is the hard technical, political, and financial work that is ahead for us. I think I'll actually leave it there since you gave me 30 seconds.
Thank you, Suneeta.
Smelters on the traceability and the anti-corruption, I think it's very related in our experience. Yeah, in our traceability system, we invent this one because our experience in fighting illegal minings is a never-ending process, because you are fighting with people, sometimes powerful people. Yeah. So back in 2022, we decided that we need to have a digital automated system that cannot be manually intervened, so that everything that goes into the system has to follow all the process and procedure. So, for example, if you are trying to influence or you are trying to bribe the government official to change the system, it's not possible. You have to fix the problem, otherwise you cannot sell your product. And as simple as that, we are able to reduce a lot of things, especially this illegal activity. And that's going back to the smelter questions that you have. In the case of the nickel, because we ban the export of the raw material, then we need to capture somewhere who is the buyer. I think this is very important part. If you have the buyer and you have the producer, you can calculate the material balance. What kind of input that you need to create this output, you match that. If in your system you say that you need actually 1 million ton of nickel ore, but you only buy based on the government system that we have 500,000, which means that the other 500,000 you are buying from illegals, and then we can easily punish the smelter. So yeah, I know this is something new, but for us, we have enough about principles, we have enough about recommendation, but how actually we implement this one is actually by digital system. You make the system that cannot be intervened by government official. It has to be automated, is interconnected between government ministries, so that you cannot just change somewhere in the middle and expect it can fix your problem. So it cannot be that way. And the second is about circularity. I think it's very important. In the next 10 years, the recycling will be, in my view, especially on the electric vehicle, will be as big as the source from the primary mining. Right now in Indonesia, the recycling technology that we have on the nickel, it can be extract 99% of the nickel coming out from the spent lithium battery. Cobalt can be 98%, lithium 95%. So I think this is something that developed countries need to think about. You cannot just rely on the primary mining anymore. So you need to develop this capacity. And I think we discussed this with European Union. I think EU, because right now EU and the US is the largest consumer of the electric vehicle in the world. So in the next 10 years, when you have this spent lithium battery, what you are going to do with it? If you don't recycle it, it's going to be a significant waste. So I think this is the only way, in my view, to actually, we can reduce this footprint on this primary mining. Develop the circularity, the technology is there, it's worked very well because we have in Indonesia. So give it a try. And I think it's very important.
Conversation about regulation and the importance of mandatory standards in the panel. And basically we were told repeatedly, voluntary standards means we're not talking about mandatory standards. Time and time again, we raised it multiple times. Regulation, call for regulation, and that was the answer. Secondly, traceability for accountability. We actually added the words for accountability because the concern was it was just traceability, and then it was even just like geographic data. We were like, well, that's not the point of this. This is about due diligence. So baby steps, let's just say that. And last, the only thing I will say is repeatedly in the panel, the co-chairs referred to civil society as holding us to a higher standard and pushing for ambition and all of these things. 100%, and that is where we're headed as well. So it's exhausting, but it's so important. And so I really do think we have an opportunity. I was frustrated that the Secretary General called this a how-to guide because it's not, but I think that in this community, we have the knowledge, the ideas, and the power to make it come to life. So we just got to keep going.
Yeah, 2 years. I think the role of the civil society to pressure the buyer is very important. Yeah, we cannot just rely on the government to enforce the regulation. But what I've seen so far in Indonesia, the role of the buyer to enforce certain standard is very important. So, for example, we have IRMA, we have RMI, we have ICMM. I think if the civil society can discuss and work with them to include what kind of principle and standard and how actually it can be implemented, I think it's very important because the pressure from the buyer, in my view, is stronger than actually coming from the government. Because from the buyer side, if you don't follow my standard, I will not buy your product. And that's the end of it. So it will limit your market. I think it's quite a danger. So in Indonesia, we have 2 companies right now participating in IRMA, several companies joining ICMM, several smelters has been participating in the RMI. So working with this standard setter, independent third party is very important to actually make sure that your interest is included in this standard setting. Thank you.
All right. So very interesting conversations, especially on business and human rights side. I think it is one of the most crucial areas that we need to focus on because there is the economic side of the critical minerals conversation, but the human side is for me the most important one, going in the sense of people before profit. That's always what we need to keep in mind. How to make those principles that we have proposed, translating into human stories and human realities, especially in the difficult context, such as in the Congo. It is a human disaster that I think the world is barely neglecting. I know there are lots of conflicts around the world, but this one is a real tragedy, and a tragedy which is really linked to one of the concerns that we pretend to share globally, like fighting against climate change, but we don't do nothing. We don't do anything for changing this context, not only in Congo, but elsewhere. So enhancing that by also defending the defenders in a more appropriate way, protecting whistleblowers and elevating the voices of communities towards, a global level. This is what we need to do. If we need this energy transition to be just, we have to be just towards the people first.